Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And as the name of my channel may suggest, I kind of like the Booker Prize, and we are gearing up for Booker season once more. The International Booker has only just finished, but in July, and so far at the time of filming this, we don't have an exact date, but in July we will find out the long list for this year's Booker. And so I wanted to have a little bit of a stab at trying to work out what books might be on there, and also to have a little bit of a guess for what my personal choices would be so far from the books that I've been reading. I will say right from the beginning, the kind of context behind this as well is that publishers are allowed to submit a certain amount of books. There's a kind of publishers are allowed one, and they're sort of very much books that were published between a specific period of time, and that is the October the 1st 2023 to September the 30th 2024. So it is also possible that a book that is not out yet, that very few people know is about to come out, is eligible. And it's often been the case that books have been released after the long list, or sometimes after the shortlist announcement as well. But for the most part, we should, most books that we know of that are coming out at the moment, are going to be eligible ones. Publishers are allowed one book, plus a few extras depending on how many books they've had in the long list over the previous years. So that can mean that some of the big publishers do tend to sort of stack up having a few more. Indie presses typically aren't able to submit as many because typically they're not as often longlisted. It's a bit of a vicious cycle at times. But the judges will read about 130, 40-ish books over a period of time, typically about 6 months, and they will then come to talk about those books. And they will, between them, decide on a long list of 13, then eventually whittle it down until we have our winner. And that is also kind of incumbent on the fact that these have to be released in the UK. They're not allowed to be self-published. They have to be novels and not, for example, a collection of short stories or memoir. Occasionally some blurring of that line is possible. So, for example, Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. Technically, if you wanted to be pedantic, could be short stories, but they're interconnected in such a way that they do form a novel whole. So I think the rules reflect that in talking about it, I think, as being something like a substantive work of fiction, or continuous work of fiction. It's something like that kind of implies that, it's not just a novel start to finish. It could be other things, but they have to kind of cohere into a sort of novel-like format. And so that leaves us with quite a few books potentially eligible, just a few. And again, it's worth noting on that kind of publisher part, with my predictions that I've done, I've not gone through with a fine-tooth comb and worked out, how many books are in there from each publisher. It could well be that I've exceeded the number of eligible books from a publisher, that I've sort of said 3 books all from one publisher, and actually they were only able to submit 2. I've not gone into that level of detail because that is quite a lot of time. So please do bear with me if I have. But with that, let's get started on talking a little bit about some of the eligible books and then what I think might come from that. I should note from the beginning, I owe a big debt of gratitude in talking about this to a Listopia list that's on Goodreads, which lists all of the eligible books. It's very much done by volunteers. It's not a kind of paid official Goodreads thing in that sense, but people have kind of gone through and done a lot of the work of, is this book eligible? Was it released in the UK and Ireland during this time? Blah, blah, blah. And so I'm using that and leaning on that quite heavily. And it's also just a thing to note as well that I think a lot of these books, these are obviously ones that we know more about. There are often curveballs and surprises in any list. And so it's quite fun to kind of see what happens with the less expected books as well. So let's get started talking about some of these. And I'm going to start from a place of books that have been big books this year. I realise that's a nebulous term, but essentially books that have made some kind of splash in some way. So a few to note right off the bat here. We have James by Percival Everett. not only has he been shortlisted in the past for The Trees, but James, which is a retelling and sort of reply to Huckleberry Finn, is a book that has sort of made a bit of a splash. It's sort of been a kind of book that has had a lot of love thrown its way, and is a book that I also think is excellent. So I would very much be rooting for it. A few other books sort of stick out along these lines too. So Blackouts by Justin Torres, for example, as well. Very highly regarded in the US. At least I think if it didn't win a Pulitzer, or kind of, it was very much one that people thought deserved to be in the Pulitzer lists. So it's very much one of those books that I think has just gotten a lot of love. I think it was maybe won the National Book Awards. I always mentally confuse those two a little bit. I know they're very different, but this is also a book that has had sort of garlands and love and whatever. And again, a book I think is excellent, and will be on my own sort of personal list, I think. Blackouts is a book that deals with sort of two characters across different generations, essentially looking back over queer history in the US, and kind of trying to understand where they both sit on this kind of timeline of everything. I think it's really beautiful and really, really well done. And apart from that, we've kind of got a few other books that have had bits of love here and there. Some books that are not out yet at the time, again, of filming, but Long Island by Colm Tobin, which is a successor to, follow-on book to Brooklyn, which was longlisted for the Booker and has received a lot of love as well. Brooklyn is sort of a big bestseller, and I think Long Island will sort of naturally land very well with a fair few people. We've also got Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, which again is sort of popped up in quite a few people's lists of sort of beloved books this year. It's sort of starting to, I think, appear in a few prize lists and things like that, and that's often a good initial sign, is when sort of other book prizes tend to sort of start picking them up. Then you get a sense that maybe a book is going to be fairly beloved. Not obviously always the case, but can often be. And we've also got kind of big heavyweights in as well. So people like Paul Auster with his book Baumgartner. Now, technically, the Paul Auster having recently died can change the eligibility, because technically it's about whether the authors typically have to be alive. However, some discretion can be made for those sorts of things, because essentially he was alive at the time of potential submission. So yeah, all of those things can be true as well. And it's also just that there are quite a few other sort of fairly well-established authors who have written books that have come out this year. So Andrew Macmillan, a sort of wonderful poet, in my opinion, I absolutely just love his work, has released a novel, Pity, which is eligible, as is Caledonian Road by Andrew O'Hagan. And as much as I think maybe he's been longlisted a while ago in the past, but Andrew O'Hagan hasn't been shortlisted before, but is an author who is sort of beloved and has sort of had a decent amount of success as well. So there are also things like that where there are technically some things of certain authors being very much eligible, or kind of being in the mix, and you can never quite kind of rule them out, essentially, because they are authors who often put out incredible work, and well-beloved work, and particularly beloved by prizes as well. And then just two more people I kind of want to know on this part here. So David Nicholls with You Are Here, which I think is a very well done book. David Nicholls, I think, has been longlisted for one of his books in the past, but also this is a book that has sort of received quite a lot of love, and I think is a really, it feels like very good David Nicholls, of sort of his very clever observations of characters, his very sort of thoughtful and precise dialogue that feels very human and very real, and things like that. And one other book that I have spoken about a lot, because I love it, Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright, which so far in 2024 and sort of the end of 2023 has been longlisted for almost every prize it's been eligible for, with the exception of the Women's Prize. the publishers and other stories have mentioned online that it was submitted from their side for the Booker. I don't know how much they're ever actually allowed to say about this, but they've mentioned that this has been longlisted for, sorry, it's been not longlisted, hopefully it will be, it has been submitted from the publishers, so we know this is the one book that I know has been submitted. Either way, this book it won the Stella Prize in Australia. It was shortlisted for the Dublin Literary Award. It's appeared on a couple of other prize lists that I've now forgotten. The James Tate Black Prize, which it won. It's kind of been a bit of a behemoth so far in prizes, and long may that continue. I think this is a book that has already made a big splash this year, and I really, really want to see this on the Booker long list because I think it deserves it, and I think this is such a singular reading experience that I just want to see it get some extra love, even though it's already been sweeping up all the prizes. So those are some of the big hitters, and now I want to focus a little bit on books by authors who have previously been shortlisted. Although I've mentioned some here, there are still a fair few that probably are in contention this year, and it's also a year where I think we've had a lot of authors sort of published books, a lot of authors who have really picked up prizes or kind of been quite popular before are really reappearing with books this year. So I think it could also be a big one. So let's look a little bit at some of those. So just scrolling through this list, there are so many authors who have been previously shortlisted, and in some cases just longlisted, but a fair few shortlisted authors here. So I'll kind of run through a few here. So obviously Percival Everett I mentioned. Hisham Matar has been shortlisted in the past. Chigozie Obioma, so far his 2 previous novels were both shortlisted, and very rightly so. I think they're both really interesting books. Rachel Cusk has been previously longlisted. Neil Mukherjee has been on the shortlist and has now got his book Choice. Nathan Hill was previously longlisted for the Nicks. I think he was longlisted. And now his book Wellness, which I think is very, very good, has been released. We also have people like Colm Tobin, who I mentioned. He's been sort of no stranger to the shortlist in the past. We have Mike McCormack, who was previously longlisted for Solar Bones, and that book also won the Goldsmiths, with This Plague of Souls, which I loved. I don't know what it was about this book that just really got me, but it did. And I think this could be an interesting dark horse to make it onto a long list. Paul Auster, I mentioned with Baumgartner, previously shortlisted for 4321. And I think actually, had Americans been eligible earlier, I think would have hoovered up shortlistings. He's a very, very talented writer. Elizabeth Strout with Tell Me Everything. She was recently shortlisted for O. William, and this is a book that returns to sort of almost her kind of metaverse. We've kind of got the Olive Kitteridge sort of books, which she won a Pulitzer for, and we've got sort of some of the characters from the O. William set, all kind of able to meet in this sort of mystical world that she's created. We've got a few other authors who've just appeared in lists all over the place before. Francis Spufford with Cahokia Jazz, and he was longlisted a couple of years back. We've just got authors here, there, and everywhere who have appeared in various capacities or on other prize lists. So Kate Grenville is eligible with Restless Dolly Maunder. We've got Donal Ryan, who has been longlisted a few times, and his book, actually I'm reading one of his now, which was longlisted, The Spinning Heart, but he has a new book, which is a follow-on from this book, which is why I'm reading this now, called Heart Be at Peace, which is due to come out soon. And that's another book that, there are previous long listings kind of going on here. Kylie Reid, who was longlisted for Such a Fun Age, has a new book, Come and Get It, coming out, which is already out, sorry. I didn't love it. So I would be fairly surprised actually if this was longlisted, because I don't think it's as strong as Such a Fun Age. But we shall see. You never know with these kinds of things. And there are just a few other authors. So Richard Flanagan, a former winner of the Booker Prize, his book will be automatically eligible to be submitted. So former winners, their new books can just get submitted. It doesn't take up a slot from the publishers. So we basically know that Question 7 by Richard Flanagan will be submitted. It's the publishers lose absolutely nothing by doing that. And so we shall see what that looks like. And those are most really of the formerly longlisted books that are eligible this year, formerly longlisted authors who are eligible this year. I've probably missed a ton of these, but those are a lot of them at least. And this is what, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about this. There have been so many books released this year, and obviously there are always tons, but it feels like loads of big name authors who maybe emerged 5-10 years ago. Seemingly this is the year that a lot of their books are coming out. So it could be quite a crowded field for this as well. And it'll be interesting to see what has actually been submitted. I kind of wish that, a few years after the event, we were able to see what was submitted, because it'd be so fascinating to see which big hitters, Demon Copperhead, for example, last year, were or were not submitted, just to kind of get a sense of that. Anyway, let's move on now to a few other books that I still think could be quite interesting, that are debuts and or indie books where there's maybe less direct love or kind of attention paid to them, but these books all could still be eligible and I think could be interesting choices as well. So there are a few debuts that have popped up in other prize lists as well that I think could be interesting here. So River East, River West, shortlisted for the Women's Prize by Aubrey Lescure, I think could be a kind of interesting book to kind of appear in a mix like this. It's a book that's already seemingly had a bit of love, and could be interesting. I've just noticed Sanjeev Sahuta's The Spoiled Heart, which I completely forgot to mention in previously shortlisted authors as well. So that's another. We also have a few books such as the ones I've got right here in front of me. So Hagstone by Sinead Gleeson, which I thought was delightful. I really loved this book. I thought it was really, really well observed and really fun, but also very clever. And she's written other books before, I think a non-fiction book and an anthology of Irish women's writing. But this is her first novel. And so it'll be interesting to see how many debuts appear, because it's a really variable number year on year. Some years you have really debut heavy. I predict, maybe I don't know quite out of where, but I don't think this is going to be a very debut heavy year. I think partly just because I think there are so many big books that have come out by established authors that I think will be jostling for that. I will also say, though, it's probably in a publisher's best interest often to submit a debut to this, because, a Paul Auster book is going to sell fairly well with or without a prize backing. But if you're a publisher and you have a debut author that you think could get onto a long list, they are going, the difference there is going to be much bigger. So debuts probably often I would imagine, get like a decent amount of submissions. Whether they make it to the long list stage is a different thing. But I think Hagstone by Sinead Gleeson would be a very worthy addition, I think personally. You also have Amma by Saraid de Silva, which I just really loved. I just thought this was a really beautiful book by Weatherglass Press, Weatherglass Books rather. And I would imagine that this would be the book that they would submit. I don't know, but I think it's just a really beautiful book, really well done, very clever in the way that it talks about relationships and family and very many other things. Sort of both very clever as a book and also very accessible and very readable, which I think would put it in good stead. I also think, and this is a book I will keep talking about, but I love, The Extinction of Irena by Jennifer Croft. And although not a debut as such, because Homesick, her other book, was sort of a novel, sort of a memoir, this book I absolutely adored, and I would love to see it on the long list, because I just think it's a really good, fun book, just really well done, just very, very fun, and really engaging. This sort of almost murder mystery, but also a book that's very heavily about translation, and I'd love to see it make it. Equally, The Night Alphabet by Joelle Taylor. I adore Joelle Taylor's poetry, and The Night Alphabet is just this incredible piece of work, I think, that really delves into violence and gender and so many other things, but through this very fantastical, lyrical book. And I would just love to see it make the long list. I also think, for example, on the kind of indie front, a book like Ghost Mountain by Ronan Hession, his book, Leonard and Hungry Paul, I just think is sensational. And I absolutely loved Ghost Mountain. I feel like it's exactly that right, happy balance between a very literary and thoughtful book, but also just this really fun, engaging, human book where there's the sort of sense of storytelling is very much come over here and let me tell you a story. And I love that. I just think this book is a gem. So I would love to see that. And then you've just got a few other debuts and sort of other books here, there and everywhere. Hard by a Great Forest by Leo, and I've just forgotten his surname. I will find it. Wait 1 second. By Leo Vardiashvili. I saw him talk about the book, and I also just really loved the book. I thought it was so well done. A book that kind of blends myths and fairy tales and the sort of harsh reality of somebody in a sort of an unusual situation. I just think it's a really solid, bold debut, and I'd love to see it appear in the long list as well. So those are some of the other books there. We've also got, you know, Michael Cunningham has had a book come out this year. You've got a few other, you know, authors like Garth Greenwell have got books out. It kind of could be anyone's game, but I'm intrigued to see what comes from it. And so from all of that, I'm going to attempt to draw out my sort of part prediction, part kind of hope long list, and let's see what happens from this. I will warn you at the before I go into that, I have a track record of getting this horrifically wrong. I think the most I've ever predicted one year was 5 out of 13, and that was high. Partly it's a fool's game because you're never actually going to get it. This is why I think I'm sort of leaning more towards the kind of ones I want to see. I've tried playing the game of looking through all of the judges and trying to understand the kinds of books they'd really love. So this year we've got someone like Sarah Collins, who is more of a sort of commercial historical fiction writer. We've got Yi-Yun Lee, who writes sort of slightly more kind of, I don't know if experimental is the right word, but kind of these slightly kind of bold, intriguing kind of books as well. You've got other people in the mix, and I can't quite work out where they would all converge on books. And so I'm intrigued because it's a fool's game. You can never really predict this through looking at the judges, because they are, even if you're like, yes, Yi and Lee, we're going to see far more like experimental, personal books. She might get outvoted, you know, on this long list, or she might like books that are very, very different from that. So with that in mind, here are the books that I would love to see and think have a decent shot at being on the long list. Again, I will most likely be very, very wrong on this, but let's see. So, I mean, a fair few of these are books that I will have already mentioned, but let's start with some sort of heavy hitters that I think have a really good shot. So first, James by Percival Everett. This book seems to be fairly well loved by pretty much everybody. It feels like a very prize loved book. And that's I don't know what that means, but it's a book that feels like it works very well to sort of what prizes often look for. It's a sort of a response to a book, in the sense of a response to Huckleberry Finn. It is very clever and literary in its way. It is very astute in talking about wider political issues. And it is also very funny and silly and irreverent at times. It's also just a very compelling read. So James by Percival Everett, I think I'm fairly sure is going to be there. I'd be very surprised if it doesn't make the long list. Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. I think this is exceptional as a piece of writing. Luckily, lots of prize sort of prize givers, I don't know I can't think of any phrases for this. Lots of prizes have very much loved it. so far, and I really want to see it also pick up a Booker long listing because I think it's worth it. And like I mentioned earlier, we know that it's been submitted. So I would also say this. The others that I'm fairly sure should have a good shout are also, so I've got my little list here, are Blackouts by Justin Torres. Partly just because I think it's even, I mean, you can't judge everything by Goodreads ratings, and you know, there have been winners of the Booker Prize that have terrible Goodreads ratings, but Hisham Matar's My Friends seems to be a book that has picked up a lot of love, and a lot of people seem to have really responded well to it. He's been shortlisted before, and I've not read it yet, but I've heard from a few people, I think including Ben Reed's Good, that it's just well worth it. So I think it's also a good shout. Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. I think this is exceptional as a piece of writing. Luckily, lots of prize sort of prize givers, I don't know what, I can't think of any phrases for this. Lots of prizes have very much loved it so far, and I really want to see it also pick up a Booker long listing because I think it's worth it. And like I mentioned earlier, we know that it's been submitted. So I would also say this. The others that I'm fairly sure should have a good shout are also, so I've got my little list here, are Blackouts by Justin Torres. Partly just because I think it's even, I mean, you can't judge everything by Goodreads ratings, and you know, there have been winners of the Booker Prize that have terrible Goodreads ratings, but Hisham Matar's My Friends seems to be a book that has picked up a lot of love, and a lot of people seem to have really responded well to it. He's been shortlisted before, and I've not read it yet, but I've heard from a few people, I think including Ben Reed's Good, that it's just well worth it. So I think it's also a good shout. I will also say, in kind of ones I'm a little bit more certain of, I think it's a bit of a wild card in some ways. So I'm kind of both certain that it has a good chance, but also it really depends on how the judges react to it. The Night Alphabet by Joelle Taylor, I just think is such a singular and creative piece of work that I think it has a really strong shout at being at least longlisted. Just because I think it's going to, if you're reading 140 books, a 400-page book that is this sort of freestyling, lyrical, brutal, passionate, thoughtful book, I think will really stick out. And sometimes that's it. Sometimes it just needs to have a little bit of extra love. Kind of, it'll sort of, yeah, it'll just find its audience, hopefully, I think, through that. I'm torn. I mean, Chigozie Obioma's book, The Road to the Country, has had a really good bit of love already, it seems, as well, online. I've yet to read it. It's not inconceivable that it could be. It's not on my list currently. Maybe after I read it, that will change, but let's see where we go. So in some ways, I guess my thumbnail for this video is a spoiler to what I think will make it, or at least hope will make it. But yeah, a few of these other ones here as well. So Hagstone, as I mentioned, by Sinead Gleeson, I think is more of a, maybe an outside chance. And I don't mean that to do with the quality of the book. I think it's a fantastic book, but just that I don't know how well it'll always land. It's difficult to tell these sorts of things. Likewise, Saraid de Silva's Amma, I just think is great. And I'd really love to see it get a bit of extra love. I also think, yeah, The Extinction of Irena by Jennifer Croft, I think it, again, is fun enough as a book that it'll really get the attention of the judges, but is also has a lot of intellectual depth to it. It's playing around with really big ideas in a really clever and innovative way, I think. Likewise, Ghost Mountain by Ronan Hession, I think is just really beautiful, and I think will capture the judges hopefully on a very human level, but also on a very intellectual level, and that often seems to be the kind of sweet spot for a lot of these things. So by my counting so far, that's 8. I'm staring down at what I'm now realizing is 6 other books that I put instead of 5. So here we go. One that is very much going to be dependent on whether it's allowed to be submitted or kind of be considered will be Paul Auster's Baumgartner. I am fairly confident, and I don't know what this is based on, I just have a hunch that it will still be eligible. That I think the judges will say, look, Paul Auster, this book was kind of submitted, hopefully submitted. It's a book that very much deals with loss, and is very much him knowing it's his final book. And I think it really deserves a long listing. I think not because of the circumstances around it. I just think it's a really beautiful book about memory and loss and love and so many other things. I just think it's a great book. Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. Technically a debut. He's normally a poet. I really loved this and thought it was just such a bold, in-your-face book, but also very deeply tender and loving. Part of me worries that it might get edged out by other books, but I think it's a really beautiful piece of writing, and I'd love to see it make the list as well. I think it's really, really great. I would also say You Are Here by David Nicholls. I think will stick out. I think it's enjoyable enough, and very human and very warm as a book, that if you're reading 140 odd books, this one will stick out for the kind of wisecracking dialogue, for all of these other things. I think it could be really interesting on that front as well. Also a book which have I just put over here? I managed to put on the floor. Orbital by Samantha Harvey, which I don't think I've actually mentioned in the video here actually, but a really beautiful and serene book that I think again will stick out for just being entirely different in its focus. It's a book that is very pensive and thoughtful and considered, and involves a lot of looking out of the window into space. And I think, as in actual space, not just like into blank space. And so again, I think is a book that could kind of sneak on there in this really interesting, beautiful way. So I'd really love to see that there. And that leaves just really a few other books that I think I'm kind of torn. I have a slight feeling that Tell Me Everything by Elizabeth Strout could have a shot. It seems to have been very well received, but I don't know if that's partly because it's part of a sort of universe in a series, right? Well, typically books that are further along in a series can do really well and be really received well because it has its audience, and its audience is ready to receive that book. I don't know if a judge who's maybe never read any of her books before would really fall in love with it in quite the same way. I've not yet read it. It does seem like it's going to be a very good one. So that's one that I'm tentative about, but I think has a shot. I'm now looking back over my list and realizing that's 14 rather than 13. So I'd probably say, if anything, maybe Tell Me Everything by Elizabeth Strout could come off, just because I think, I don't know, who knows how that's going to be received, but it does seem to have received a lot of love so far, so maybe. But let's potentially take that off the table here for now. Again, who knows? I may be entirely wrong. I probably am. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What books do you think could make it that haven't been that I've not mentioned? I realize, for example, even looking back at this list, the kind of the Goodreads list, we've got Clear by Karis Davies that loads of people have voted on as being a contender. And I started it recently, but realized I wasn't really in the right headspace when I started it. So I need to start it again, and I will report back on how I find it this time. Also, Monique Roffey has released her book Passion Tide, and she was the winner of various sort of prizes. I think the Costa Prize maybe a bit ago for The Mermaid of the Black Conch, if I've got that title right. And so again, who knows? But I think those are the 13/14 that I'm going with at the moment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think could be a good addition to this list? Also, I'm very aware my list is very UK and US focused. That's, again, I guess, a lot of the books I see and hear about. The prize typically has a few books from other countries as well, so hopefully that will be the case, just to really round it out and have more of a sense of global literature. But we shall see. Anyway, love to hear your thoughts. Take care and speak to you all soon. We're almost in booker season. Bye bye.